Welcome back to Dimensional Shift. I had a question recently from our server about how to embody the divine will or be a vessel for the divine. So the first thing we have to really look at is, what do we mean by divine? And this question has an inherent flaw to it, and that is that the divine is somehow separate than us. So that's the first thing that has to be reconciled. What are we assuming is separate than us? What are we assuming is out there beyond us? Is this what people call God? Is this the idea of source consciousness? Even just the universe itself unfolding, the higher self? All of these are an assumption that there's somewhere else, happening somewhere else, and that we have to do something in order to embody that. That being said, there is, of course, an evolution of consciousness that occurs. And the distinction between where it occurs and who it occurs to is kind of the irony of the question. Because in order to be a vessel for what we might call the divine or a higher state of consciousness, we have to empty ourselves of the I that wishes to become the vessel. This I, what we might call mind activity, the thinking mind, the egoic mind, the separate self, these personal stories that we have, the seeking, the drive, the need for, the should-haves, the could-haves, the would-haves, the need to, all of that ends eventually with enough evolution and enough inquiry into the mind itself. And when we arrive there, it is living in a state of absolute surrender to what you might call the divine, although it's seen not to be anything separate. And this is flow, this is the liberation, this is the spontaneity arising, but it's not happening to any particular person. No separate self exists. And this emptying of ourselves is an extremely difficult process. There is a primal existential terror that exists within consciousness itself. And it's almost dualistic in nature, that existential terror. There are two sides to the coin of existential terror. One can be seen as the fear of death, the drive to stay alive, the survival mechanism that operates within us. But there's also the other side, which is suffering. And suffering leads to what Freud called thanatos, that death and drive to self-destruction. And these things kind of fight against each other. And this has been highlighted to me in almost every ayahuasca ceremony that I've been to. We have this primal drive to survive, but we also have this need for the end of suffering. And this is reflected in the yin-yang symbol, where we have two sides of the circle, one in each color. And when we can reconcile both of those and see the whole circle and empty ourselves, then we can act spontaneously and live in authenticity and be a vessel for what we might consider the divine, even though we've realized that there's no separate divine self, no separate divine being that's watching everything, none of this, that there's no separation. It's all happening all at once in one place, or one churning, I don't know how to explain it. It's very hard to explain, but it's so fundamental that until you really recognize it, you can't explain it. It's beyond words. The yin-yang symbol is probably the best way to look at it. But we, of course, have many personal stories, and we have the conditioned mind. We have behaviors that occur even though we don't know why they occur or how they occur or what causes them to occur. We have triggers and thought loops and all of these things that come up in this process. And that's why shadow work is so important. And shadow work is the process of inquiring to and releasing these ingrained patterns of behavior, the conditioned mind, which you might think of as programming in your mind, the thought loops. And eventually it can be seen that there are endless problems, there are endless personal stories, there is endless conditioning, because it's not the stories that are the problem, it is the need to have a story. It's the addiction to the conditioned mind, it's the addiction to the personal I, it's the addiction to shadow work or healing and all of that. And if you can get down to the core of that endless, it's an endless fountain of problems, and you can objectively view that just as every other passing transient thing in reality. Every person, every item of value, every emotion, every thought is just a passing phenomenon. Well, so is the addiction to thought, or so is the addiction to identity, or anything else. It's all transient. And if you can see that all of that is, I think Eckhart Tolle called this the structure of the ego. So first you have to empty yourself of the content, which is, I place value on who I am as, I will say, a podcaster. That you get rid of that. There's no podcaster. There's no attachment to being a podcaster. There's no drive to call myself that. And then you get down to the structure of the ego, and that's what I'm speaking of, is this addiction to, I have to call myself something, I have to do something, I have to be somebody. And that's the structure of the ego. And then we can begin dismantling that until there's no one left inside. There's just emptiness within. And then we can really start to move with spontaneous authenticity, and we can begin to speak from a deep place of understanding and love and compassion, because we're no longer showing up for this invisible separate self in our head that we think we are just because there's noise in our head. Now we can start focusing on others. And I think that most people who talk about wanting to embody the divine will or be a vessel for the divine are really looking for a way to show up for others. Of course, the inherent paradox is that once you realize there's no separate self within you, there's also no separate self within anyone else. So who are you actually helping? And then it becomes, we go back to this thing I can't describe. I want to call it, we'll just call it an ecosystem, because I really don't know how to put it into any better words. And in my mind, conceptually, it looks kind of like an atom or a molecule with these parts and pieces, but it's all connected. This body, which there's still a body, it's just not my body. I don't have any claim over it. It's still supported by the chair I'm sitting in, which is supported by the floor, which the house is supported by the ground. Everything is interconnected. So you have this interconnectedness, this web. And when we can empty ourselves of anything within that we perceive is within, and we can begin to focus on what you might call external reality. Of course, there's no separation between those two. I think that motion of moving back into reality is what a lot of people are looking for, if they're not coming from a place of spiritual ego, which is also possible when we start talking about being a vessel for some greater force and all of these things. It's often can be ego of, if I can save the world, then I might feel better about whatever it is that I feel inherently flawed for. So how do we begin to see the structure of the ego and this addiction to thought and this addiction to needing to be someone. And I found great value in listening to Eckhart Tolle. I found great value in mindfulness practices. I recently discovered the YouTube channel Simply Always Awake, and I really recommend him. I think his name's Angelo, for the non-dual aspects of it. But really we have to start observing all of these emotions and thoughts and things, the stories that come up, and our attachment to things, and really inquire as to who is it that is observing that. And Ramana Maharshi, of course, was kind of the founder of the Neo-Vedanta school of self-inquiry. And this path isn't for everyone. There are other ways to awaken to. You have like the Bhakti Yoga and the path of devotion. The path of negation, which I feel like Ramana Maharshi really spoke to, is I am none of the transient phenomena here. I'm not a podcaster. I know that will end someday. I'm not a person because I know my body will die someday. But there's still something very fundamental at the very, very deepest, furthest back layer of who you are. And that is, of course, that you're the observer, which is no one. Your mind is going to have, your thinking mind is going to have a whole bunch of objections to this realization. And that again is the structure of the mind. But your mind may go through, there's has to be a purpose, or I have a purpose. This one spiraled me out really, really badly last year. I went into really, really deep nihilism. And that's part of it, going through these really, really core aspects of who the ego thinks they are and what they're here to do and all of these things is also part of the transience. And you don't have to go into nihilism. That just happened to be a really deep trigger point for me. But exploring the idea of there's no purpose. Nothing here actually makes sense. It's just kind of all a chaotic mess, it's kind of like a circus. But, explore those concepts and just see what comes up for you emotionally and energetically. I went through also, this is boring. That's also the mind trying to escape its own illusory nature. If I can tell myself that this is boring and I'll believe it, then I won't actually let it go. I will just sit here and do nothing and maybe just die. I went through that for quite a while. That's like the ego pouting, and that can be seen through as well. That's just a game that your thinking mind is playing that eventually can be seen as illusory as well, because the thinking mind thinks it's in control, but it's not, and that's why there's always like this feeling of discomfort and unsettled, and because it's the one that suffers. And it causes its own suffering because it never wants to disappear into the present moment. In the present moment, the egoic thinking mind doesn't exist. And so there's that primal drive for desire, but it's actually keeping you from acting in spontaneous joy. For example, I really wanted to record this podcast. I was really excited about it, but I sat on my couch for like 2 hours this morning, giving myself excuses and feeling afraid, and I haven't done this in a while, maybe I'm going to screw it up and all these things. And finally I was just like, this is so silly. I'm putting off something that I know I will enjoy just because I'm listening to my thoughts. And the thoughts, of course, create the body sensations and the emotions to, create that whole effect. But don't think that just because the mind activity stops, you're suddenly going to do nothing. It's not how it works, because then actually you get to get up and do the things that you really do want to do. One that really got me for quite a while was, I'm really curious about this, and I wanted to follow the thought threads, and I wanted to learn these things, and I wanted to have the content and the knowledge and the this and that and the other. And part of that is joy for me. I really do love to learn. But it was also an endless seeking of, if I could just have this more information, then maybe things would make sense. And so understanding which part of that is a drive to add to the egoic self and which part of it is just a joyful learning is kind of a differentiation that I've had to make, that maybe you will have to as well. One that I've worked through recently that kind of inspired this whole episode is that stories are fun. And I've always loved to write, and I always love to tell stories. I always love to take in stories, and that's kind of life. We're all just a story. And so I have this underlying attachment to stories themselves. And so letting that go and being able to enjoy a story while it's happening, but still keeping a certain perspective of who it's happening to and the illusory nature of the story itself, and detaching myself from that addictive need to identify with stories. One of the last ones that I'll mention is particularly painful in this state of the world, and that's this need to fix the issues in the world, the need to save the world, the need to focus on the problems of the world. And this one I know is going to cause probably the most difficulty for the people in my community, because we do have a tendency to want to change things. The problem is that we're doing this in the thinking mind, and the thinking mind can only focus on the problems. And it's not until we can cease the thinking about the problems and center ourselves in the here and the now, in the present moment, and focus on the things that we can do. The rest is just all delusion. It's all fantasy. It's all daydreaming. We're not actually affecting any change by being in our minds thinking about the ways that we're going to save the world. And we're not going to change the world by getting on the Discord server and talking about how good we are and how much we're going to save the world. That's not how saving the world actually happens. It happens not through mental activity, not through focusing on all the problems, but by coming into the present moment and really looking at reality around you. I think of this as like a reality check, doing a reality check in your immediate moment and environment and saying what needs to be done here and now, because that is the only thing that we can really do. And if we each showed up in this way, in this higher state of consciousness, which we might call the present non-dual state, and we took care of our little corner of this ecosystem, the whole ecosystem would, of course, start to heal itself. So all of these objections that your mind will come up with and everything else that it comes up with is going to be et al. Ad nauseum, which means and all the rest forevermore, because that is the structure of the ego, the structure of the thinking mind. That there's always a problem to solve if it just had more information, if it had this to add to itself or that to bolster itself, because it has this obsessive, compulsive, neurotic need to know, do, be more. And so we're just going to start first taking out the content, which is, I am not this label that I give myself. This possession that I have doesn't add to me. I'm not the body, I'm not the mind, I'm not my actions, I am not the money that I make, I am not the people that I surround myself with or that are drawn to me. None of that has anything to do with me, because the me that I think I am doesn't exist. And there is no separate self, because the separate self is the mental activity seeing itself as a separate self, but that separate self is only a reflection of consciousness, and it's a poor reflection, it's a shadow. So don't Look at the shadows. Go back to Plato's allegory of the cave, the shadows on the wall. Think of the cave as your mind and the thoughts as the shadow on the wall. And we're slowly coming back to reality. We're exiting the cave. We're looking up at this beautiful creation, the trees outside and the squirrels and the dogs barking and the flowers that are starting to bloom and the bright sun, and we're coming out of the cave of the mind and we're coming back into harmony with consciousness itself. And consciousness itself is built upon the void of awareness, which is the one and the none, and they're the same, and they're not separate, and they never will be separate. That is non-duality, that you are both divine, and the divine doesn't exist, and everything is divine, and everything is perfect, even if it doesn't make sense. And so I wanted to leave you with this quote. I think this quote it's one of my favorite quotes, I think, because it takes a very famous, I don't know if it's Taoist or Buddhist kind of, not a belief, they generally don't have beliefs, but you are a drop in the ocean. But this is a Rumi quote who takes it one step further, and I'm going to say that both are right. You are a drop in the ocean, yes. Rumi says, you are not a drop in the ocean, you are the entire ocean in a drop. And those both are correct. And reconciling and accepting that both are correct is really how we begin to reconcile the ultimate paradox. And that's kind of what we're working on doing. Is they say that eventually all paradoxes reconcile, and this is part of it. So thank you all for listening. Hope you have a wonderful week, and I will talk to you next Monday.